Okay, we're gonna go ahead and get started. I thank everyone for joining this morning. This, as I said in an email, we are doing a series of webinars, one a month, every fourth Friday of the month. And I want to first apologize that the appointment for these series, it was causing a lot of issues for folks. And so I went ahead and deleted it, and we're going to try to find a better way to get this on everyone's calendars so that it's not causing problems. Hopefully next month we'll have a solution, and I'm not sure why that particular appointment was causing everyone grief. But thank you for joining. And this month, obviously, we're talking about Asian carp. And next month, we're going to talk about clean energy. And then the following month, we hope to do a webinar with a group called 1% for the Planet, which was developed as a part or a project of Patagonia. And it talks about social responsibility with businesses. So we will tee those up in the coming weeks, and we hope you can make that as well. And then right before we start, I just want to put another plug out for our Mackinac Island Policy Conference event, Happy Hour next week, which is next Wednesday at 6 o'clock at Pink Pony. I hope that everyone can make it. That event is going to have Senator Peters speaking. We're going to hear from Congresswoman Dingell. In fact, I have someone from Washington, D.C. calling me right now, so it's probably another representative. So we will have several congressional members up there speaking, as well as either the governor herself or staff from the governor that will provide an update on Line 5. So we hope to see you there, and share it with your network, and let me know if you have any questions. So we'll go ahead and get started, and I will kick off this series by introducing my colleague, and many of you have probably worked with him on the communications front, and it's Drew Youngdyke, who works for us at the National Wildlife Federation and works with the Great Lakes Business Network on communications. And he, as another role, also works on Asian carp and works to tell the story of what's at risk if we don't address this particular invasive species. And just so I'll go through the agenda. We're going to talk about what invasive species are, why the Asian carp is a poster child for invasive species, how we're going to address this problem, or how we have teed it up to address this problem, who some of the targets are to make sure that we are getting to the finish line on prevention of having this particular species in the Great Lakes. And then we're going to hear from Brian with True North, and he will talk about his advocacy as well as what's at risk for him to try to put more of a fine-tuned perspective from the business, Great Lakes businesses. So with that, I will go ahead and kick this off to Drew. And the one last thing I will say is that we are recording this webinar for folks that aren't able to make it. And so just a heads up that you are being recorded.
Thank you, Beth. So yeah, as she mentioned, I'm Drew Youngdyke, Senior Communications Coordinator with the National Wildlife Federation. Big news on Asian carp actually today. So before I jump into what is an invasive species, I just want you all to know that the news broke overnight that the final chief's report for the Brandon Road Lock and Dam Plan was approved by the Army Corps of Engineers that will now get sent to Congress. And that's something that we've been working on for a few years now to try to shake loose from the Corps. So I'll go into more about that, but you're probably seeing maybe your social media or news feeds pop up with that, and I want you to be aware of that. Invasive species, obviously these are non-native species. The difference between a non-native species that may be desirable, such as an introduced species, and an invasive species is it's one that negatively impacts the other native species all around it. And Asian carp are one of the most insidious invasive species. The reason for this is Asian carp were imported into mostly southern aquaculture fish farms, although there was some federal agency importation of some grass carp as well, in the 60s and 70s. The reason they were imported is they're filter feeders, so they're not predatory fish. They eat primarily plankton, which is the base of the food chain. Because they're voracious eaters, because they have no really known predators in U.S. waters, at least not at any numbers, and because they reproduce so quickly that they really consume so much of that base level of the food chain that they starve out the bait fish above it, the other planktivores. And then those are, of course, the food chain for the predatory fish that are generally your game and sport fish, both the introduced and the native sport fish. So where they've already escaped, especially they started escaping in floods in the 70s and 80s, and then especially in the early 90s, they have steadily made their way. They occupy waters from Louisiana to Minnesota, from Tennessee and Kentucky, all the way to North Dakota. So they really occupy a large swath of the heartland. They are not, and this is extremely important, they are not yet, at least as far as bighead and silver carp, in the Great Lakes. So it is not too late to stop them, but it is a race against time. There are 4 different species of Asian carp: bighead, silver, black, and grass carp. Bighead and silver carp are the ones that are in the Chicago area waterway system that we're trying desperately to keep out of Lake Michigan. Silver carp are the ones which you'll see jumping out of water when disturbed by boat motors. They can get up to 60 pounds plus. Bighead carp can get up to 80 plus pounds, and they really have the same impact on the food resources. And what they've done in those waters then is greatly reduce the biodiversity of the fish species in those waters they've overtaken. And of the species that are left, they're also diminished as far as their weight gain, their size, how well they're doing. And so we don't want to see that happen to the Great Lakes, and especially the Great Lakes connected waters. What's going on right now is in 2017, the USGS conducted a food availability study, and what they determined is that within a mile of the coast all the way around Lake Michigan, Asian carp would have enough food resources, that plankton and algae, to be able to spread really throughout the Great Lakes, and especially within the connected embayments and river mouths and inlets and connected waters. So there was some speculation that maybe they wouldn't be able to survive in the deep cold water of Lake Michigan. However, the food availability study suggests that they really wouldn't have a problem, which then exposes all the different connected waterways, and especially the bays and river mouths and connected rivers all the way around Lake Michigan as they go around. So that's the threat that they pose to Lake Michigan, that they pose to the Great Lakes as they make their way around Green Bay, Saginaw Bay, Grand Traverse Bay, Little Traverse Bay. Those are all places that are especially at risk, as well as those connected rivers. So what's going on to stop them right now? Well, for close to a decade, it seems like the Army Corps of Engineers has been studying different options to close those connections between the Mississippi waterway system and the Great Lakes waterway system and basin. Some of those have already taken place. There was the Eagle Marsh berm, which was completed in 2016 in Indiana. That closed a flooding pathway near Fort Wayne. There was the St. Anthony Falls Lock and Dam, which was closed in Minnesota. That closed another pathway, northern pathway between the Mississippi and Great Lakes. The main one that we've been focusing on then is the Chicago area waterway system, which is the one that's left. There are 3 existing electric barriers in that system, but those were really developed to prevent species going the other way, such as round goby. And while they do provide a deterrent, they are not foolproof. And even since those electric barriers have been in, there have been multiple cases of eDNA, which is the environmental DNA of Asian carp, which have been found on the wrong side of those barriers. And twice, both in 2010 in Lake Calumet, where a bighead carp was found, and just in June 2017, where a silver carp was found near the Lockport Lock and Dam pool. That was a little bit further in, just 9 miles from Lake Michigan. They have found live silver carp on the wrong side of those barriers. So we know those existing barriers are not foolproof. there's existing activities that are conducted by the Asian Carp Regional Coordinating Committee, which is a group of all these different agencies working together to fish them down and try to keep them away from Lake Michigan. That requires consistent funding to keep that going, and we don't view that as a long-term permanent solution. A couple years ago, the Army Corps of Engineers released a draft plan that suggested building an engineered channel at the Brandon Road Lock and Dam, which provides a choke point about 47 miles south of the lake before it spreads out to multiple other connections to the lake. At this Brandon Road Lock and Dam, what they would do is build an engineered channel. Within that engineered channel, there would be a suite of fish deterrent technologies that we call the gauntlet. There would be an air bubble curtain, another electric barrier, complex noise cannons, and a flushing lock. They originally proposed water jets, but in the final version, they replaced the water jets with like a water bubble curtain that provides both visual, audio, and touch deterrence to Asian carp going through. With those 4 different technologies, it provides redundancy and really greatly reduces the odds that Asian carp can get through there. The cool thing about the engineered channel is it would also be designed so that it can accommodate new technologies as they're developed. So there's USGS and these agencies are always working on new technologies that might be even more effective in stopping the transfer of species. For instance, chlorine is something they're researching, the use of CO2 within a chamber as the boats move through. And so these are stuff that they're researching to try to get right. If they can get those right, they would be able to then install those in the engineered channel and even increase its efficiency even more. So this plan had gone through a couple different iterations over the last couple of years. And as I mentioned, just this morning, the Army Corps of Engineers put its final stamp of approval on this plan by signing what's called the Chiefs Report. What happens with the Chiefs Report now is it gets sent to Congress. Congress has to approve and fund the plan in order for it to go into effect. And it could take up to 5 years for this plan to get built once they start, which is why we don't want to see any delay in this from Congress. So at this point, the pressure is going to be really all on Congress to move swiftly to approve and fund this plan, likely in some part of a larger piece of legislation like the Water Resources Development Act as it moves through, or some other piece of must-pass legislation. But they have to get the pressure from their constituents and from the folks that they listen to make sure that's a high enough priority that they put it into that kind of legislation. It does come with a high price tag. Originally, it was estimated at $275 million. In the final version, the Corps estimated $778 million. It's important to remember when you hear that sticker shock, though, that about a third of that is a contingency cost. It means that they don't actually estimate it will cost that much. They want to build that much cushion in, and it's actually the largest contingency they've ever built in. So it may be on the high side of that estimate. So it may really only cost about 2/3 of that much. But even if it costs that much, the Great Lakes support a $20 billion tourism industry, as well as a $7 billion annual sport fishery. So when you consider a one-time investment of $778 million compared to an annual economic impact of $7 billion, if they got in and what they could have a negative impact on, it's still a great investment even at that high sticker shock. So this is where we're sitting right now. Just last night, the final Chiefs Report was signed and it was sent to Congress. And so now we'll be putting, at least from NWS perspective, we'll be putting our efforts into really put the pressure on Congress to include that and approve and fund that plan. Happy to take any questions.
Yeah, and I will just say, because I had this question this morning. So what you're seeing right now is a view of the channel that they're trying to obviously put in place, the barrier that Drew just described. And I had to ask Mike, well, what about this natural area just to the south of the image? And he said that that's all a giant it's elevated, so they cannot get up that. So I just
They
wanted to,
can't jump that high.
I just wanted to make sure that people understood that, because I had questions, so I'm sure you were like, well, wait a minute, why only that one little section? So
you know, and this brings up another point. There's often concern expressed that what we're doing is closing down a fish passage connection for this to keep the Asian carp out. I think most of you know, but for those that don't, this is an artificial connection between the watersheds. The Chicago area waterway system is an artificial connection between the Great Lakes and Mississippi watersheds. That was never a natural connection. There was kind of an elevated high point at Chicago that historically blocked that connection, and this canal breached that connection. So when we're talking about closing down the connection between these, the first most important point is actually we're no longer looking at shutting down shipping. Shipping will continue, and that was a compromise that had to go through, otherwise nothing would be done. The other thing is the fish passage that we're closing down is an artificial fish passage between two watersheds that were never naturally connected historically. So the types of concerns that we see from dams or in the Pacific Northwest blocking salmon passage or things like that, that's not a concern here because it's always been for the last 100 years an artificial connection to begin with.
And then before we go into questions, I'm going to have Drew back up a little bit because I want to show people that are not familiar with Asian carp what they can do. And this is just part of the impact that we'd be seeing. Drew also mentioned the biodiversity that would be greatly declined, that they would be competing, our native fish would be competing with these fish, and oftentimes they lose. So here's a more physical impact that we would see if they did enter the Great Lakes. And this
silver carp on accident.
This mechanism where they jump out of the water, and Drew can explain this better than I, but it's a defense mechanism that they have when they are spooked. They jump, which is often triggered by motorboats and other loud noises that are in the water.
Right. So it's, and it's the same thing that actually is what they're using the technology for the acoustic deterrent in the engineered channel to repel them backwards. But yeah, when they're disturbed by boat motors, this is a silver carp. They can do this. And when you see this picture, imagine the tourism areas where water skiing, where jet skiing, where fishing, where kayaking even is happening. Imagine those tourism areas and the outdoor recreation and tourism county that supports trying to have those activities take place in the midst of this type of fish jumping activity. So that's what we're worried about, and I know Kaz will address that a little bit more when he speaks as well.
And then this can show the size that they can. Is this a particular species?
That's a big head.
Okay.
Yep. So that's the biggest one that they grow to. Silver carp don't get quite that big, but at 60 to 70 pounds, that's a pretty big missile coming at you. But yeah, that's just the size of them. And when you see a single fish, realize when they take over a watershed, they coat the bottom like a shoal of fish that just coat the bottom, and it really starves out literally everything else above it.
And this graphic shows the progression of this species and where it has shown up. So I think from right now we will pause and we'll take some questions if folks have them. Great. Okay. So we will then, I want to introduce, well, I'll actually have Drew introduce Brian. And then we're going to show a video before we kick it off to you, Brian. We'll show the video, and I apologize. I have to share screen again. So give me just a second. And while I do that, I'll have Drew go ahead and introduce Brian.
All right. So Brian Kosmiski is a trout guide and the owner of True North Trout up in Boyne City, Michigan. He's also a representative for multiple fishing gear manufacturers, including Temple Fork Outfitters or Temple Fork Power to the Angler. Kaz, you can correct me if I got that wrong. And Brian's been a volunteer with multiple conservation organizations through a variety of levels. He's worked with us to help elevate the awareness of the Asian carp problem within the hunting and fishing community, including through this video that he recorded a couple years ago. And he's just been an excellent both business voice and business representative on this and multiple other water-based environmental issues, but a great volunteer as well. And I've gone fishing with him. He's a great trout guide too, put me on quite a few, but as good as he is, he couldn't get over my terrible ability to actually set the hook. So with that, I'll introduce Brian Kosminski of True North Trout, who's also a member of the Great Lakes Business Network.
And
good morning.
Good morning.
Yes, go ahead.
Thank you for joining. And if you don't mind, I'd love to show the video, Brian, that you
Go right ahead.
helped us pull together. So I appreciate it.
We can't replace this. We can't rebuild this ecosystem. The Great Lakes have already been jeopardized enough. I would be out of a job if Asian carp were to take hold in the Great Lakes. We're at the pinnacle of three of the best Great Lakes in the world between Superior, Huron, and Michigan. And I would hate to see something happen to Lake Superior or Lake Michigan as far as the fisheries go. A collapse would be catastrophic.
All right. Brian, thank you so much for your advocacy on this issue. And I'd love to kick it off to you to describe what you have been doing to date and where this issue could impact you.
Absolutely, my pleasure. My name is Brian Kosminski. Thank you for having me on. And Drew, awesome. You opened my eyes on a whole bunch of more other issues that we have. It's amazing watching the progression of Asian carp move up the Mississippi all the way into our back door, literally. I'm on the shores of Lake Charlevoix. I just went paddleboarding this morning. We are blessed to live in an area of this country where every summer I see hundreds of thousands of people come up and recreate. They're either on power boats or sailboats, canoes, kayaks. They're at the beaches. They're camping. And I don't honestly believe, I also work in the restaurant industry, so when I have a chance to talk to people one-on-one when they're sitting at a table, and they talk about how beautiful the water is and how gorgeous it is up north, and I said something about our concerns with Asian carp to a couple of older diners, and they said, well, they'll never get up here. They're not going to like this. And I said, we can't chance that. Imagine what would happen if you were a boat company manufacturing Four Winds power boats and you were jet skiing or you were skiing, and all of a sudden our lakes and rivers had millions of these 60-pound missiles flying out of the water hitting you. I don't think too many people would sell too many power boats or jet boats or pontoons. We could see our economy in northern Michigan completely shrivel up. I also volunteer for Tip of the Mitt Watershed Council doing macroinvertebrate studies on a lot of our rivers. And I don't know if there's been studies, Drew, you could answer this for me, but if we took out all the zooplankton and the phytoplankton out of our shorelines, what would those macroinvertebrates have to feed on that they depend on that as well? If we lose our macroinvertebrates, then we're losing our forage fish. And on top of losing forage fish, we lose our predator fish. What about the migratory bird species that use the Great Lakes as a thoroughfare to get to breeding grounds in the north and the south? They no longer have a place to stop because they don't have any food to feed on either. There's so many aspects, and I'm just not talking as a fly fishing guide who likes to take people fly fishing for trout on the Jordan River. I'm talking about a global impact on a lot of species of animals, not just fish, birds, wildlife that prey on the fish on the shoreline. We could see a total collapse of an entire food pyramid from the bottom to the top, and it's mind-boggling when you think about it. Drew, do you have any input on what would happen with our macroinvertebrate population if carp got in, if Asian bighead silvers, any of them got into the Great Lakes?
I'm not aware of a study that's looked specifically at macroinvertebrates. The most on point, as I mentioned, was a USGS 2017 study that looked at the algal food resources in the basin inlets. And I talked with Heather Hettinger, who's a fisheries biologist, actually for Kaz, you know her, up in your area, and she really focused in on what they would do in the spawning areas for fish. So, for instance, just below Lake Charlevoix at the South Arm, where it connects to the Jordan River, is an estuary that provides spawning habitat both for the lake run species that come in from Lake Michigan, the ones that inhabit Lake Charlevoix, as well as for some of the trout species that go up into the Jordan River. And she really identified that spot with no block to them as a place where they could really take over and then deplete the food sources there. And when you look at grass carp, which there are some grass carp which are in the Maumee River watershed connecting to Lake Erie, and we need a serious effort to eradicate those. Those really have impacts on waterfowl through they're voracious eaters of wetland plants. And so they really hammer waterfowl habitat with their impacts as well. So yeah, there's both aquatic and wildlife impacts from those, but I'm not aware of a specific macroinvertebrate study yet.
Gotcha. No, I just think it's something that we need to be aware of and be concerned that the average person doesn't think about or realize what one species, when it consumes 70 to 80% of its body weight a day in zooplankton, how quickly it could decimate an entire ecosystem. And their reproduction, there's nothing that eats them because their skulls are very thick, and even as a small minnow, they grow very. Basically, a carp, Asian carp, is in the minnow family, and it's a large minnow. It's made to reproduce and reproduce fast. If we had something that actually ate them, that would be that would almost be the small silver lining, but there isn't a silver lining on the entire issue. The other negative downside, if a breeding pair were to get into, let's say, the St. Joe, the Grand River, the Muskegon, the Pere Marquette, the Betsy, I can go on and list 100 rivers all the way up the Michigan West coastline, we would never, ever be able to eradicate them out of a system like the Grand River unless we completely killed off the entire thing. And even if we did that, there are too many sub-channels and feeder creeks that they could go into and still reproduce. And I don't think there's a possible way we would ever be able to turn back the clock and stop it or reverse it.
Do folks have any questions so far on what it is and what Asian carp means to the Great Lakes?
Or any questions in general?
Yeah. So I will then go ahead and get a little bit into so we have received a small grant of money, the National Wildlife Federation, through the Mott Foundation, to work on organizing businesses around this issue of Asian carp. And as Drew mentioned, we are in a position now where we need to shift gears and focus on trying to get this through Congress. And so we are going to work a little bit through the lens of the Great Lakes Business Network to put some advocacy behind our federal leaders to get this across the finish line, and hopefully within the next year have a more permanent barrier that's being constructed. So in the next few months, definitely keep an eye out for opportunities for engagement. We're likely going to host an event in Chicago to bring in businesses to talk about this issue. We would love to have your support in reaching out to your Chicago networks, building an interest. And then we'll also have some direct action that we will push through, which could include sign-on letters or meetings with lawmakers in Chicago, as well as our sitting congressional members and senators as when they're in Chicago in our home base. So I'll keep you posted on opportunities. And then Mark, who has been, Mark had to jump off because we've had breaking news on Asian carp. Is there anything you'd want to add from the political lens on next steps? Mark Smith is our program lead for Asian carp and our policy. What's your technical title here, Mark? Policy director?
Sure. Yeah, thanks, Beth. Sorry, everyone, I was a little bit late. I was just talking to a couple of reporters, and I'm sure Drew had mentioned earlier that today's a really big day and that Congress finally received a report on ways to keep Asian carp out at the Brandon Road Lock and Dam, culmination of over a decade of compromise down to the point where we are today. So as we shift towards Congress, now we have kind of a recommendation from the Corps to move forward. So really our job is to encourage, not just Great Lakes members, but this is a national issue. I mean, there's carp all up and down from Louisiana all the way up to Minnesota. So, one of the important things is securing down the Great Lakes members of Congress for sure, but we also have to make the case of the investment from members of Congress outside of the Great Lakes, why they would support this plan. No one wants to see the Great Lakes end up like the waters down in Kentucky and Tennessee, where it has shut down a lot of businesses, impacting voting. No one wants to see that happen up here in the Great Lakes. So it's really going to take a concerted national effort to respond to this. And having you all play a role here is so welcome and needed, because the business community's voice really makes a difference when they unite and speak together. We've seen that with the hunting and angling community. When they speak together, it makes a big difference. It moves a lot of certain members of Congress. Certainly you all know more than anyone, when the business community unites, it really moves certain members of Congress to respond accordingly. And so we're trying to bring those type of voices, your voices, to Congress to really round out the need to take action. So really excited you guys are on the phone today. Happy to work with you and answer any questions you guys may have.
All right, we'll open it up for questions one more time, and I appreciate everyone joining this call and being a part of this discussion to learn more about this critical issue and our next steps. Do folks have any final questions?
Nice smallmouth, Mark.
That's what's that's at risk right there.
That's what Cameron and Kentucky.
It is. No, it's, and they're already competing for their livelihood right now against a whole bunch of other invasives with the gobies and everything else. So we can't throw one more thing into the mix.
That's a great point, Brian. What the biologists are estimating is, Asian carp would have enough of a negative impact on the Great Lakes and their connected waters, even without the existing invasive species that are in there, because of what they do to the base of the food chain. But when you consider the impact of zebra and especially quagga mussels, which are already all over the Great Lakes and connected waters, they've already greatly reduced the food availability at that base of the food chain that's available in the Great Lakes and connected waters. And so what you would have then is there's still enough for Asian carp, but kind of just enough for Asian carp, where they would kind of come in and finish off what the quagga mussels have already done.
True, very true. A good analogy I heard somebody say, and this is in relation to stocked trout versus wild trout, but imagine you're at a senior home with an all-you-can-eat pizza buffet, and all of a sudden 2 college football buses pull up and all the college players get off. They wipe out the entire buffet, and the old people have nothing left to eat. That's what would happen essentially if the Great Lakes were invaded by Asian carp. They would take all the leftovers and nothing would be left for what's already in the lakes.
Oh, well, this is definitely a sobering issue, and I'm hopeful that we can really move the needle in the next year to push Congress. And I know that we will be looking to the Great Lakes Business Network membership as well as our prospect members to help us in this regard. So I really appreciate everyone joining. We will get this webinar up on YouTube so that the folks that could not join can learn more, and we'll likely circle around to this issue again later this year and provide some updates to folks on what's going on. So thank you for joining, and please reach out to myself, to Drew, to Mark, if you have any questions at all.
Thank you for hosting.
Yeah, thank you, and everybody have a great holiday weekend.
Happy Memorial Day.
Enjoy those lakes.